An Outline of Esoteric Science. Rudolf Steiner. Preface. Now that 15 years have elapsed since this book first appeared in print, I may well be permitted to say something in public about the state of mind that gave rise to it. My original plan was to make the essential content of this book into the final chapter of Theosophy 1, another book of mine which was published much earlier. This did not work. When Theosophy was going to press, the subject matter of this current book had not achieved closure in me, as was the case with that of Theosophy. In my imaginations, the spiritual being of the individual stood before my soul and I was able to describe it, but this was not yet true of the cosmic relationships that were to be presented in esoteric science. Individual details were there, but not the total picture. So I decided to have Theosophy published in its present form, containing what I had seen as the essential spiritual being in the life of the human individual, and to complete esoteric science in the near future at my own pace. In keeping with my mental attitude at that time, the content of this book had to be presented in the form of thoughts that were further elaborations of thoughts applied in the natural sciences, adapted for presenting what is spiritual. You will note in the introduction to the first edition, reprinted here, that I felt a strong responsibility toward the natural sciences in everything I wrote about spiritual cognition at that time. However, the spiritual world as it reveals itself to spiritual sight cannot be presented exclusively in thoughts of this sort, since this revelation does not conform to a mere thought content. Anyone who has directly experienced the nature of such revelations knows that the thoughts of our ordinary consciousness are suitable only for expressing sensory perceptions, but not for spiritual perceptions. The content of spiritual perception can only be conveyed in images, imaginations, through which inspirations speak, while these inspirations in turn stem from a spiritual entity perceived intuitively. Necessary information on the nature of imagination, inspiration, and intuition can be found here in Esoteric Science and also in my book How to Know Higher Worlds. At present, however, those who describe imaginations from the spiritual world cannot present only these imaginations. Doing so would be to present the contents of a completely different consciousness, something that would stand alongside contemporary knowledge without relating to it at all. People who have such imaginations must fill our present-day consciousness with what can be seen by a different consciousness that looks into the world of the spirit. The content of what they present will be the spiritual world, but in order to become fully comprehensible to our ordinary consciousness, which thinks in modern terms and does not yet see into the world of the spirit, this spiritual world must flow into our thoughts and appear in thought form. It will remain incomprehensible only if we ourselves place obstacles in its path, that is, if we subscribe to contemporary prejudices about the limits of knowledge that result from an incorrectly conceived view of nature. In spiritual cognition, everything is immersed in subtle soul experience, not only spiritual perception itself, but also the type of understanding that ordinary unseeing consciousness brings to it. If people of superficial knowledge claim that others who believe they understand are merely talking themselves into it, this demonstrates that they themselves do not have the faintest idea of this subtle experience. But the fact of the matter is that the merely conceptual expression of truth or error in our understanding of the physical world becomes an actual experience for us when we face the spiritual world. If we allow our opinion to be even ever so slightly influenced by the assertion that the limitations of an ordinary consciousness that does not yet perceive prevent this consciousness from understanding spiritual perceptions, then this judgment, this feeling, blankets our comprehension like a dark cloud, and we really cannot understand. But to an unperceiving but unbiased consciousness, spiritual perceptions are fully comprehensible if seers cast them in the form of thoughts. They are comprehensible in the same way that a painter's finished picture is comprehensible to a non-painter. However, understanding the spiritual world is not an artistic, feeling process like understanding a work of art, but a thinking process like that of science. But in order to make this understanding really possible, those who present spiritual perceptions must be able to cast them in the form of thoughts without having them lose their imaginative character. All this stood before my soul as I drew up my esoteric science. In 1909 I then felt that the prerequisites were in place for me to be able to produce a book that 1. Cast the content of my spiritual vision in the form of thoughts to a certain provisionally adequate extent, and 2. could be understood by any thinking people who placed no obstacles in the way of their own understanding. I say this today and state at the same time that in 1909 I thought I was taking a risk in publishing this book. I knew that professional scientists were incapable of mustering the necessary impartiality, as were numerous others who depended on science for their judgment. But the fact that stood before my soul most clearly was that in an age when humanity's consciousness was furthest removed from the spiritual world, there was an urgent need for communications from this world. I counted on the fact that there were also people who experienced being distanced from all spirituality as such an impediment to life that they were grasping at communications from the spiritual world with inner longing. The years that followed confirmed this completely. Theosophy and esoteric science, books that require the goodwill of the reader in dealing with a difficult style of writing, have both enjoyed wide circulation. I tried very consciously not to supply a popular exposition of these themes, but one that requires the reader to exert a good deal of thought in approaching the content. Because of the character I imprinted on my books, merely reading them is already the beginning of spiritual training. Exerting one's thinking in the calm and collected way that this reading requires strengthens the reader's soul forces and makes these forces capable of approaching the spiritual world. Calling the book Esoteric Science caused immediate misunderstandings. I was informed from all different directions that something that intends to be a science must not be esoteric or secret. How thoughtless such objections were! As if anyone who actually publishes a content wants to be secretive with it. The whole book shows that nothing was meant to be labeled secret, it was meant to be cast in a form that made it as understandable as any science. When we use the term natural sciences, don't we mean to indicate that we are dealing with the knowledge of nature? Esoteric science is the science of what takes place esoterically in the sense that it is perceived, not outside in nature, but where one's soul turns when it directs its inner being toward the spirit. Esoteric science is the opposite and the counterpart of natural science. My perceptions of the spiritual world repeatedly met with the objection that they were reproductions and transformations of concepts about the spiritual world that came to the fore in ancient times. It was said that I had read many of these things, absorbed them into my subconscious, and then presented them in the belief that they sprang from my own perceptions. I was said to have derived my reports from Gnostic teachings, the poetic wisdom of the Orient, and so on. The thought that went into these claims is very superficial. I am fully conscious of the fact that my knowledge of spiritual things is the result of my own perception. Whether with regard to details or in the broader surveys, I subjected myself to strict tests to make sure that each step in the progress of my perception was made in full and deliberate consciousness. I told myself that just as a mathematician proceeds from one thought to another without autosuggestion or the unconscious playing any role in the process, spiritual perception must proceed from one objective imagination to another, without anything being active in the soul except the spiritual content of clear and collected consciousness. Knowing an imagination to be not merely a subjective image but a reproduction in image form of an objective spiritual content is an achievement of healthy inner experience. It is achieved on the level of the soul and spirit in the same way that a healthy person distinguishes between fantasy and objective perception in the realm of sensory observation. So there I stood with the results of my perception before me. To begin with, they were perceptions without names. Later, I needed words in order to describe and communicate them, so I then went looking in older accounts of spiritual matters for ways to express these still nameless things in words. I made free use of the terms I found, so my usage almost never coincides with the ancient meaning. However, in every case, I went looking for such possibilities of expression only after the content had become apparent in my own perception. I was able to eliminate what I had previously read from my own perception and research by means of the state of consciousness that I have just described. It was also claimed that the terms I used were reminiscent of ancient ideas. People fixed their attention on the expressions themselves without going into the content. If I spoke of lotus flowers in the human astral body, that was proof that I was repeating ancient Indian teachings in which that term is found. If I used the terms angeloi, archangeloi, and so on, then I was simply reviving concepts of Gnostic Christianity. I was constantly confronted with the objections of entirely superficial thinking of this sort. I wanted to point to this fact too, now that a new edition of Esoteric Science is being published. This book, since it contains the outline of Anthroposophy as a whole, is especially susceptible to all the misunderstandings Anthroposophy is exposed to. Since the time when the imaginations presented in this book first merged into a complete picture in my soul, I have constantly been developing my ability to perceive the human being, the historical development of humanity, and the cosmos. But the outline I offered in Esoteric Science 15 years ago remains unshaken as far as I am concerned. Everything I have been able to say since then, if inserted into this book in the right place, seems only to elaborate on that outline. Rudolf Steiner. January, 1925. Chapter 1. The Character of Esoteric Science. The ancient term esoteric science is used to describe the contents of this book. This term immediately rouses the most contradictory feelings among contemporary people. For many it is somewhat repellent or calls forth derision, pitying smiles, and perhaps even contempt. They imagine that a way of thinking that describes itself in this way can only be based on idle, fantastic dreaming, that this alleged science can only conceal an impulse to reinstate all kinds of superstitions that those familiar with the true scientific approach and real striving for knowledge are quite right in avoiding. To others, what is meant by this term seems to provide them with something they cannot acquire in any other way. Depending on their personal predispositions, they are drawn to it either out of a deep inner longing for knowledge or out of the curiosity of a refined soul. Between these sharply divergent opinions there are all kinds of possible intermediate stages of conditional rejection or acceptance of what different individuals may think of on hearing the words esoteric science. For many people the term esoteric science has a magical ring to it because it seems to appease their fateful obsession with knowing of something unknown, mysterious, or even obscure, with a knowledge that cannot be acquired naturally. Many people do not want to satisfy their soul's deepest longings with something that can be clearly known. They tend to believe that in addition to what is recognizable and knowable in the world, there must also be something that eludes cognition. Regarding their deepest longing for knowledge, and with a peculiar illogicality they do not notice, they reject everything known and choose to accept only something that cannot be said to be knowable through any natural form of research. Anyone who speaks of esoteric science would do well to keep in mind the need to confront misunderstandings caused by some of its advocates who are striving not for knowledge but for its opposite. This account is aimed at readers who will not allow their impartiality to be shaken by the fact that a term calls forth prejudices under certain circumstances. There can be no talk here of a knowledge that is secret in the sense of being accessible only to certain people because of some especially favorable destiny. We will do justice to the term esoteric science as it is used here if we think of what Goethe had in mind when he spoke of the revealed mysteries in the phenomena of the universe. His view sees what remains secret, esoteric, or unrevealed in the phenomena we grasp only with our senses and our sense-bound intellect as the content of a supersensible way of knowing. Of course, to those who restrict science to what is revealed through the senses and the intellect that serves them, what is meant here by esoteric science does not constitute a science. If such people wish to understand themselves, however, they must admit that they reject esoteric science not on the basis of well-founded insight, but simply on the authority of their purely personal feelings. In order to realize this, all we need to do is to consider how sciences come about and what significance they have in human life. The definitive factor in the birth of a science is not the object that is studied but the type of human soul activity that takes place during the scientific quest. The activity and attitude of the soul involved in the study of science is what we need to look at. If we acquire the habit of exercising activity of this sort only when dealing with what the senses disclose, we may easily succumb to the opinion that the sense perception is the essential factor. In that case, we fail to look at the fact that specific activities and attitudes of the human soul have been applied, but only to what is sense perceptible. However, it is possible to transcend this arbitrary, self-imposed limitation and look at the character of scientific activity itself without regard to its specific application. This is our basis for speaking of knowledge of the nonsensory content of the world as scientific. The human power of cognition tries to become involved with this content in the same way that it would otherwise become involved with the world's natural scientific content. It is the intent of spiritual science to free the methods and attitudes of scientific research from their particular application to the relationships and processes of sensory facts while preserving their way of thinking and other attributes. Spiritual science attempts to speak about non-sensory things in the same way that the natural sciences speak about sense-perceptible things. While natural scientific methods of research and ways of thinking stop short at the sensory world, esoteric science views the soul's work in the natural world as a means of self-education and attempts to apply the faculties that develop in this way to non-sensory domains. Instead of attempting to speak about sensory phenomena as such, esoteric science speaks about the non-sensory contents of the world in the same way that scientists speak about its sense-perceptible contents. In this process, it retains the inner attitude of the scientific method, which is what makes the study of nature a science in the first place. This permits esoteric science to call itself a science. When we begin to consider it, we will find that the significance of the natural sciences in human life is not exhausted in acquiring knowledge about nature, since this knowledge can never lead to anything except experiences of what the human soul itself is not. The soul principle does not live in what we know about nature, it lives in the process of knowing. The soul experiences itself during its active involvement with nature, and the result of this living involvement is something other than knowledge about nature itself, namely the self-development experienced in acquiring this knowledge. Esoteric science attempts to apply the result of this self-development to areas that transcend mere nature. It is not the intent of esoteric scientists to underestimate the value of the natural sciences. On the contrary, they try to acknowledge it even more than the natural scientists do. They know that it is impossible to establish any science without the exacting way of thinking that is the rule in the natural sciences, but they also know that after this exactitude has been acquired by genuinely entering into the spirit of natural scientific thought, the soul's strength can hold it fast and apply it to other fields. Something appears at this point, however, that may cause misgivings. While observing nature, the soul is guided by the object under observation to a much greater extent than it is while observing the world's non-sensory contents, when it has to be able to hold fast to the essence of the scientific way of thinking out of purely inner impulses to a much greater extent. Since many people believe, although not consciously, that only the guidance of natural phenomena allows us to retain this essence, they tend to decide dogmatically that as soon as this guidance is abandoned, the soul with its scientific method is left groping in the dark. These people have not become aware of the distinctive character of this method. For the most part, they base their judgment on errors that necessarily arise when someone whose scientific attitude has not been sufficiently reinforced by observing natural phenomena nonetheless proceeds to observe non-sensory domains. Such cases naturally give rise to a lot of unscientific talk about the world's non-sensory content. However, this is not because such talk is essentially incapable of being scientific, but only because in this particular instance the scientific self-education that comes from observing nature was neglected. With regard to what has just been said, however, anyone wanting to speak about esoteric science must keep a sharp eye out for all the distractions and illusions that can arise from conjecturing about the revealed mysteries of the world without approaching them scientifically. And yet it would be counterproductive, right at the beginning of an account of esoteric science, to speak about all the possible aberrations that discredit its research in the minds of biased people, because these people conclude from the very existence of the aberrations, and it is true that they are very numerous, that the entire undertaking is unjustified. In most instances, however, scientists or scientifically minded critics reject esoteric science dogmatically, as was described earlier, and their reference to the aberrations is merely a pretext that is often unconscious. Discussion with such opponents will prove futile. Indeed, nothing prevents them from raising the very justified objection that there is no way of determining from the outset whether the person who believes others are in error actually possesses the firm foundation described above. Therefore, all that can be done by people who are striving in the direction of esoteric science is to present what they believe is permissible for them to say. Whether this belief is justified can only be decided by others, and in fact only by those who avoid dogmatic statements of any sort and are able to enter into how these esoteric researchers communicate the revealed mysteries of cosmic events. Of course, the researchers will be obliged to show how what they present relates to other achievements of knowledge and of life. They will also need to show what opposition is possible and to what extent life's immediate outer, sense-perceptible reality confirms their observations. However, they should never attempt to present things in a way that depends on the art of persuasion rather than on content for its effect. Esoteric scientific accounts often meet with the objection that they do not prove what they present, that they merely make some assertion or other and say that esoteric science has determined this to be true. Do not misunderstand the account that follows by thinking that any part of it is being presented in this manner. An effort is being made here to allow the capability that unfolds in the soul through studying nature to continue to develop according to its own essence. In the course of this development, the soul encounters supersensible facts. It is assumed that every reader who is able to really go into what has been presented will necessarily run up against these facts. The moment we enter the domain of spiritual science, however, we encounter a difference between it and purely natural scientific observation. In the natural sciences, facts are present in the field of the sensory world. Scientists who present these facts regard the activity of the soul as something that recedes into the background in the face of sense-perceptible relationships and processes. Those who present spiritual scientific facts must place this soul activity in the forefront, because their readers only arrive at the facts by making this activity their own in the right way. Unlike the facts of natural science, which, although not understood, are still available for human perception even without any soul activity, spiritual scientific facts enter into our perception only through activity on the part of the soul. Thus those presenting spiritual science presume that the readers are accompanying them on the search for these facts. Their presentation consists of recounting the discovery of these facts and is governed not by personal whim, but by a scientific attitude trained by natural science. Therefore, they must also speak about the means they use to become able to observe non-sensory, supersensible things. By attempting to present an esoteric scientific subject, we will soon see that this leads us to acquire concepts and ideas that we did not possess before. The new thoughts we acquire about the nature of proof are also different from our previous conceptions of it. We learn to recognize that when natural science is explained, proof is something brought toward it from the outside, so to speak. In spiritual scientific thinking, however, the activity applied to proving something in natural scientific thinking is already present in the search for the facts. We cannot find these facts if the path that leads to them does not constitute a proving process in itself. Anyone who really follows this path already experiences the element of proof, and nothing more can be accomplished by means of a proof applied from outside. Failure to recognize this characteristic of esoteric science has led to many misunderstandings. The whole of esoteric science must spring from two thoughts that can take root in each human being. For the esoteric scientist, as the term is used in this book, these two thoughts express facts that can be experienced if we apply the right means. For many other people, these thoughts constitute extremely debatable claims that can provoke a great deal of argument and may even be proved to be impossible. The first of these thoughts is that behind the visible world there is an invisible one, a world that is temporarily concealed, at least as far as our senses and sense-bound thinking are concerned. The second is that by developing human capacities that lie dormant in us, it is possible to enter this hidden world. Some people may say that there is no such hidden world, that the world we perceive with our senses is the only one, that it contains everything necessary to solve its riddles, and that even if we are far from being able to answer all our existential questions at present, a time will come when sensory experiences and the science based on them will be able to provide the answers. Others say that we cannot state definitively that there is no hidden world behind the visible one, but our human powers of cognition cannot penetrate this world because they have limits that they cannot overstep. Although those who need faith may take refuge in a world of that sort, a true science based on the guarantee of fact cannot be concerned with such a world. A third group sees it as rather presumptuous to want to penetrate into a domain where we must renounce knowledge and be content with faith. Those who adhere to this position find it wrong for the feeble human being to want to penetrate into a world that is supposed to be the exclusive province of religious life. Still others raise the objection that it is possible for everyone to share a common knowledge of the facts of the sense-perceptible world, but since knowledge of supersensible things is only a matter of personal, individual opinion, we should not speak of universal certainty in such things. And there are others who make many other assertions. It becomes clear that observing the visible world presents us with riddles that can never be solved on the basis of the facts of this world alone. They will never be solved in this way, regardless of how far the science of these facts may advance, because the very inner nature of the visible facts points clearly to a hidden world. If we do not realize this, we are shutting ourselves off to the riddles that spring up everywhere out of the facts of the sensory world. We choose not to see certain questions and riddles, and so we believe that all questions can be answered by means of sense-perceptible facts. The questions we choose to ask may indeed all be answered by the facts we expect will be discovered in the future. There is no reason not to concede that this is the case. But why should we wait for answers to certain things if we ask no questions about them? Those who aspire to an esoteric science are only saying that the questions they ask are a matter of course for them and should be acknowledged as fully legitimate expressions of the human soul. After all, science cannot be forced into narrow confines by forbidding people to ask unbiased questions. In response to the opinion that there are limits to human cognition which we cannot overstep and which force us to come to a halt in front of any invisible world that may be there, it must be said that there can be no doubt in anyone's mind that it is not possible to push one's way into an invisible world with that particular kind of cognition. For anyone who believes that form of cognition to be the one and only form, it is impossible to arrive at any other view of the matter than that human beings are denied access to any higher world that may exist. But it can also be said that if it is possible to develop another form of cognition, this could lead into the supersensible world. If we consider this form of cognition impossible, we reach a viewpoint that makes any talk of a supersensible world seem like pure nonsense. To an impartial judge, however, the only possible reason for this viewpoint is that its champions are unfamiliar with any other form of cognition. Yet how can people pass judgment on something while insisting that they know nothing about it? Unbiased thinking must concur with the statement that we should speak only about things we know and not make statements about things we do not know. This kind of thinking can only speak of people's right to communicate what they have experienced, but not of any right on their part to declare something impossible if they know, or choose to know, nothing about it. No one can ever deny others the right to ignore the supersensible, but there is never any legitimate reason for people to declare themselves authorities, not only on what they themselves are capable of knowing, but also on what they suppose cannot be known by any human being. In the case of those who declare it presumptuous to enter the domain of the supersensible, an esoteric scientific view must call their attention to the fact that it is possible to enter this domain and that we sin against the faculties we have been given if we allow them to stagnate instead of developing them and putting them to use. However, anyone who believes that views concerning the supersensible world are strictly a matter of personal opinions and feelings denies what is common to all human beings. It is certainly true that individuals must find insight into such things on their own, but it is also a fact that all people who go far enough come to the same insight about these things rather than to different insights. Differences exist only when people try to approach the highest truths through an arbitrary personal whim rather than by a scientifically guaranteed path. It must be admitted without reservation, however, that only those who are willing to immerse themselves in the unique character of the esoteric scientific path are capable of acknowledging that it is correct. If we acknowledge, or even merely assume or surmise from the manifest world, the existence of a hidden world, and if our awareness that our powers of cognition are capable of development compels us to feel that this hidden world can reveal itself to us, then each one of us will be able to find the way to esoteric science at the individually appropriate time. When individuals have been led to esoteric science by these soul experiences, several prospects open up before them. One is the prospect of finding the answer to certain questions posed by their craving for knowledge. Another is the quite different prospect of victory over everything that impedes and weakens life. In a certain higher sense, it signifies a weakening of life or even a soul death when a person is forced to deny or turn away from the supersensible world. Under certain circumstances it even leads to despair when someone loses hope that the hidden will be revealed. At the same time, the various forms of this death and despair oppose esoteric scientific efforts on the inner level of the soul. They set in when our inner strength dwindles. If we are then to have any strength for life at all, it must come from outside. Then we perceive the things, beings, and processes that appear to our senses, and we analyze them with our intellect. They cause us joy and sorrow, they drive us to whatever actions we are capable of. We can carry on like this for a while, but eventually we reach the point of dying inwardly, because we have exhausted what can be drawn from the world in this way for a human being's sake. This is not a statement stemming from the personal experience of one individual, it results from an unbiased consideration of all human life. What shields us from exhausting this source is the hidden element that rests within the depths of things. Ultimately, if the strength to descend into these depths to draw up new strength for life dies away in a human being, the outer aspect of things also proves to be no longer conducive to life. This is by no means a matter of concern only to the individual human being with his or her personal well-being and misfortune. Precisely through true esoteric scientific observations, we arrive at the certainty that from a higher standpoint, an individual's well-being and misfortune are intimately related to the well-being or misfortune of the whole world. We come to the insight that we are causing damage to the whole world and all the beings in it when we do not develop our own forces in the right way. If we ravage our life by losing our connection to the supersensible world, not only do we destroy something within us, something that can ultimately drive us to despair as it dies off, but our weakness also creates a hindrance to the evolution of the entire world in which we live. Now, it is possible for human beings to deceive themselves. We can succumb to the belief that there is no hidden element, that what appears to our senses and our intellect includes everything that can possibly exist. This deception, however, is only possible on the surface of consciousness, not in its depths. Our feeling and desire do not submit to this deceptive belief. In one way or another, they will always long for something hidden. If this is withheld from us, it forces us into doubt, into uncertainty in life, or even into despair. Cognition that reveals what is hidden is suited to overcoming all this hopelessness, uncertainty, and despair. In short, everything that weakens a life and makes it incapable of performing the services required of it within the world as a whole. This is the beautiful fruit of spiritual scientific knowledge. Rather than merely gratifying our passion for knowledge, it gives our life strength and steadfastness. It draws strength for work and confidence in life from an inexhaustible source. No one who has ever truly approached this source and returns repeatedly to take refuge there will ever go away unstrengthened. There are people who do not want to know anything about such knowledge because they see something unhealthy in what has just been said. As far as the outer, superficial aspect of life is concerned, these people are right. They do not want what life offers in its so-called reality to be diminished in any way. They see it as a weakness when people turn away from reality and seek salvation in a hidden world that seems fantastic and dreamed up. If we do not want to fall into a state of pathological dreaminess and weakness in our spiritual scientific search, we must acknowledge that such objections are partially justified. They rest on healthy judgment that leads to a half-truth rather than to a whole one only because it does not thrust its way into the depths of things but remains on the surface. If striving for supersensible knowledge were likely to weaken life and turn people away from true reality, then such objections would certainly be strong enough to pull the foundation out from under this spiritual trend. However, it is not appropriate for esoteric scientific efforts to respond to such opinions by defending themselves in the usual sense of the word. In this case, too, they can speak only out of their own merit, which is apparent to any unbiased person, and make it evident that they supplement the life forces and strength for life of anyone who immerses him or herself in them in the right way. Such efforts cannot turn a person into a dreamer or someone who is alienated from the world. The strength they provide comes from the sources of life that are the origin of the soul and spiritual parts of us. Still other obstacles may confront many people when they first approach an esoteric scientific search. It is a fundamental truth that readers of esoteric scientific accounts find descriptions of soul experiences which they can follow in order to approach the world's supersensible contents. But while this is the ideal, it still has to be realized in actual practice. Readers must first absorb a fairly large number of supersensible experiences recounted by others without experiencing them personally. This cannot be otherwise, and will also be true of this book. The author will describe what he believes he knows about the nature of human beings and what happens to them at birth, at death, and in the body-free state in the spiritual world. He will also describe the evolution of the earth and of humanity. It could seem that a certain amount of alleged knowledge is being presented like dogma, as if belief based on authority were called for. However, this is not the case. In fact, what can be known about the world's supersensible content is present in the author as a living soul content, and immersing yourself in this content kindles impulses in your own soul which then lead to the corresponding supersensible facts. In reading about spiritual scientific knowledge, you are active in a different way than you are in reading accounts of sense-perceptible facts. If you read accounts of the sense-perceptible world, you read about them, but if you read accounts of supersensible facts in the right way, you immerse yourself in the stream of spiritual existence. By taking in the results of spiritual research, we also set out on our own inner path toward discovering these results for ourselves. It is true that to begin with, what is meant here is often not noticed at all by those who read it. People imagine entering the spiritual world to be much too similar to a sensory experience, and so they find their experiences in reading about this world much too thought-like. But if we are truly absorbing these things as thoughts, we are already in the midst of the spiritual world and must only realize that we are already experiencing, although we do not notice it, what we believed we were merely receiving, in the form of thoughts communicated to us. The real nature of what we have experienced will become completely clear to us if we actually practice what is described in the second and last part of this book as the path to supersensible knowledge. It would be easy to believe the opposite, that the path would have to be described first. But that is not the case. To anyone who simply does exercises in order to enter the supersensible world without paying any sole attention to specific facts about it, this world will remain an indistinct and confused chaos. We learn to find our way into that world naively, so to speak, in the process of learning about some of its specific facts. Only after that do we abandon our unsuspecting naivete and realize that we are fully consciously acquiring for ourselves the experiences that have been communicated to us. If you go into esoteric scientific accounts in depth, you will be convinced that this is the only sure path to supersensible knowledge. You will also realize that the opinion that supersensible knowledge might initially affect us like dogma, through the power of suggestion, as it were, is unfounded, because we acquire the content of this knowledge by means of a soul activity that strips it of any merely suggestive power and only allows it to speak to us in the same way as any truth that addresses our level-headed judgment. Our initial failure to notice that we are living in the spiritual world is not due to lack of thought on our part or to being influenced by suggestion in taking in what we have read, but only to the subtlety and unfamiliarity of what we have experienced while reading. When we first take in communications such as those in the first part of this book, we begin to participate, with help, in knowledge of the supersensible world. Through practical application of the soul exercises given in the second part, we begin to know this world independently. No real scientists will be able to find any essential contradiction between their science, which is based on the facts of the sense world, and how the supersensible world is investigated. These scientists use certain tools and methods. They produce these tools by transforming what nature gives them. Supersensible cognition also makes use of a tool, the human being, that must also first be made suitable for higher research. The human abilities and forces that nature provides without any involvement on the part of the individual must be transformed into higher ones. This is how we can transform ourselves into instruments for investigating the supersensible world. Chapter 2. The makeup of the human being. When we observe the human being from the viewpoint of a supersensible mode of cognition, the general principles of this cognitive mode take effect immediately. This way of looking at the human being is based on recognizing the revealed mystery in our human makeup. Of all the elements supersensible knowledge includes in this, the physical body is the only one that is accessible to our senses and our sense-based intellect. To clarify this concept of the physical body, we must turn our attention first to a great riddle that envelopes all of our observations of life, the phenomenon of death and, connected with it, so-called inorganic nature, the mineral kingdom, in which death is always inherent. This points to facts that can only be fully explained through supersensible knowledge, and a significant portion of this book will have to be devoted to them. At this point, however, the intent is simply to offer a few ideas for the sake of orientation. Within the manifest world, the physical human body is the part of the human being that is the same as the mineral world. In contrast, everything that differentiates us from minerals cannot be considered part of the physical body. To an unbiased view, the most important fact is that death exposes the aspect of our human makeup that is of the same nature as the mineral kingdom. We can refer to the corpse as the aspect that, after death, is subject to processes that are found in that kingdom. It can be emphasized that in this element of our human makeup, the corpse, the same substances and forces are at work as in the mineral kingdom. However, it is necessary to emphasize equally strongly that this physical body begins to break down when death sets in. Yet we are also justified in saying that while the same substances and forces are at work in the physical human body as in minerals, as long as we are alive they work in the service of something higher. Only after death do they work in the physical human body as they do in the mineral kingdom. They then appear in the form that is true to their own nature, that is, as disintegrators of the physical body's form. Thus, in the human being we must distinguish clearly between what is manifest and what is hidden. During life, a hidden something has to wage a constant battle against the mineral substances and forces in the physical body. If this battle ceases, their mineral effects come to the fore. At this point, supersensible science must get involved. Its job is to look for what wages the battle, for something hidden from sensory observation and accessible only to supersensible observation. A later chapter in this book will discuss how to reach the point where this hidden something becomes as evident to us as sensory phenomena are to our ordinary eyes. For the moment, however, what is revealed to supersensible observation will simply be described. It has already been stated that information on how to approach higher vision can only be of value to people if they first become familiar with accounts of what supersensible research reveals. In this field it is indeed possible to comprehend things that we cannot yet observe. In fact, understanding is the first step toward achieving vision in the right way. Although the hidden something that fights off the disintegration of the physical body is only visible to higher sight, its effects are clearly evident to a faculty of judgment restricted to manifest phenomena. These effects express themselves in the shape or form that the physical body's mineral substances and forces share during life. Once death sets in, this form gradually disappears and the physical body becomes part of the rest of the mineral kingdom. However, what prevents the physical substances and forces from going their own way during life, which would cause the physical body to disintegrate, can be observed by supersensible perception as an independent part of our human makeup. This independent element will be called the ether body or life body. In order to prevent misunderstandings from creeping in right at the outset, there are two things that must be considered with regard to the terms applied to this second element of our human makeup. First, the use of the word ether is different here than it is in modern physics, which describes the medium of light as ether. Here, however, the meaning of the word will be restricted to the one given above. It will be applied to this entity that is accessible to higher vision but recognizable to sensory perception only because of its effects, that is, because it is capable of giving a particular shape or form to the mineral substances and forces present in the physical body. Second, the word body should also not be misunderstood. After all, we have to use words taken from ordinary language, words that express only sense-perceptible things, to designate the higher things of existence. In sensory terms, of course, the ether body is nothing bodily at all, no matter how fine or delicate a body we might imagine. As the author has discussed in his book Theosophy, his intention in using the terms ether body and life body is not simply to revive the old scientifically outdated idea of life force, or vital force. Having arrived at the point of mentioning the ether body or life body in describing supersensible things, we have also reached a point where this description necessarily contradicts some modern-day views. The evolution of the human spirit has led to a situation where talking about such an element of our human makeup is necessarily seen as unscientific nowadays. The materialistic view has reached the point of seeing nothing more in the living human body than an assemblage of physical substances and forces such as are also found in minerals, in so-called inanimate objects. The only difference is supposed to be that the way they are put together is more complicated in living things than in lifeless matter. Not too long ago even ordinary science had different views on this subject. If you track down the writings of serious scientists from the first half of the 19th century, you will find that, at that time, even some real scientists were also aware of something in living bodies that is different from what is present in lifeless minerals. Back then, people spoke of a vital force or life force. Admittedly, they did not imagine this life force as the life body described above, but their concept was based nonetheless on an inkling that something of this sort does exist. They imagined this life force as supplementing the physical substances and forces of the living body, just as the force of magnetism supplements the plain iron in a magnet. Then came a time when this life force was removed from the stock of scientific concepts, and people tried to explain everything in terms of mere physical and chemical causes. More recently, however, a reaction against this has again set in among some scientific thinkers. In some quarters, it is admitted that assuming the existence of something like a life force is not total nonsense after all. However, even scientists who deign to admit this possibility will not want to make common cause with the view of the life body that has been presented here. As a general rule, engaging these people in dialogue from the viewpoint of supersensible knowledge will lead nowhere. Instead, supersensible knowledge should make a point of recognizing that the materialistic view is a necessary concomitant of our era's great progress in natural science, which is based on a tremendous refining of our methods of sensory observation. In the course of evolution, it is simply part of human nature to raise some specific individual capabilities to a certain degree of perfection at the expense of others from time to time. Human faculties that lead to hidden worlds had to be forced into the background by the exact sensory observation that the natural sciences developed to such a significant extent. But now a time has again come when we need to cultivate these faculties. We will win acknowledgement of what is hidden, not by combating judgments that are the logical consequence of denying the existence of hidden elements, but by showing these elements themselves in the right light so that they can then be acknowledged by those for whom the time is right. This needed to be said here to keep people from assuming that the author is ignorant of the views of natural science when he talks about an ether body, something that is necessarily seen in many quarters as a figment of the imagination. This ether body, then, is a second part of our human makeup. Supersensible knowledge attributes a higher degree of reality to it than to the physical body. A description of this body as supersensible knowledge sees it can only be given in later chapters of this book, once the sense in which such descriptions are meant to be taken has become evident. For the moment, let it suffice to say that the ether body permeates the physical body in all its parts and is to be seen as its architect, so to speak. The shape and form of all our organs are maintained by the ether body's currents and movements. Our physical heart is based on an ether heart, our physical brain, on an ether brain, and so on. The ether body is differentiated just like the physical body, but it is more complicated. In the ether body, everything is in a living, flowing state of interpenetration, whereas in the physical body, distinctly separate parts are present. Having an ether body is common to plants and human beings in the same way that having a physical body is common to humans and minerals. Every living thing has its own ether body. From the ether body, we move on to a further component of our human makeup. To help us visualize this next part, supersensible observation points to the phenomenon of sleep, just as it pointed to death in the case of the ether body. As far as everything manifest is concerned, all our productive actions are based on activity in the waking state. Waking activity, however, is only possible if we repeatedly draw new strength for our exhausted forces from sleep. Doing and thinking disappear during sleep, all suffering and pleasure are submerged as far as our conscious life is concerned. When we awaken, conscious forces rise up out of sleep's unconsciousness like water out of hidden and mysterious springs. The consciousness that sinks down into the dark depths when we fall asleep is the same as the one that rises up when we awaken. According to supersensible cognition, what awakens life again and again from the unconscious state is the third part of our human makeup. We can call it the astral body. Just as the physical body cannot maintain its form by means of the mineral substances and forces it contains, but only by being permeated by the ether body, the forces of the ether body are incapable of illumining themselves with the light of consciousness. Left to its own devices, the ether body would have to remain in an ongoing state of sleep. We might also say that it would only be able to support a plant-like existence within the physical body. A waking ether body is illumined by an astral body. As far as sensory perception is concerned, the effects of the astral body disappear when a person falls asleep. To supersensible observation, however, the astral body is still present but appears to have separated from the ether body or lifted out of it. Sensory perception does not deal with the astral body itself but only with its effects on manifest elements. These effects are not directly present while we sleep. In the same sense that having a physical body is something we share with minerals and the ether body something we share with plants, with respect to our astral body we are of the same nature as animals. Plants exist in a continuous state of sleep. If we do not judge these things accurately, it is easy to fall into the error of crediting plants with a consciousness similar to what animals and humans have in the waking state. This error is only possible if we form an inexact concept of consciousness. When an external stimulus is applied to a plant, it makes certain movements just as an animal would do. We can say that plants whose leaves curl up under certain external stimuli are sensitive to these stimuli. The deciding factor in consciousness, however, is not the fact that a being responds to stimuli, but the fact that it inwardly experiences something new in addition to the mere response. Otherwise, we would also be able to speak of consciousness when a piece of iron expands under the influence of heat. Consciousness is only present when the being in question has an inner experience of pain, for example, as a result of the heat's effect. The fourth element that supersensible cognition ascribes to our human makeup has nothing in common with the manifest world that surrounds us. It is what distinguishes us from our fellow creatures and makes us the crown of creation, of the created world that belongs to us at least temporarily. Supersensible cognition forms a concept of this next part of our human makeup by pointing out essential differences among our waking experiences. These differences immediately become apparent when we turn our attention to the fact that in the waking state we are constantly in the midst of experiences that are necessarily transient, while, on the other hand, we also have experiences of which this is not true. This difference becomes especially clear when we compare our human experiences to those of animals. Animals experience the influences of the outer world with great regularity, under the influence of the warmth and the cold, of pain and pleasure, and certain regularly recurrent processes in their bodies. They become aware of hunger and thirst. Such experiences do not constitute the entire scope of our human life. We can develop desires and wishes that transcend all this. It would always be possible, if we were able to go far enough, to demonstrate where the cause of an animal's action or sensation lies, whether within its body or outside of it. This is by no means the case with human beings. We can produce wishes and desires that are not adequately accounted for by causes either within or outside of our bodies. We must acknowledge that everything falling into this domain has a special source. In spiritual scientific terms, this source can be seen in the human eye, which can therefore be called the fourth part of our human makeup. If the astral body were left to its own devices, pleasure and pain and sensations of hunger and thirst would take place in it, but there would be no sense of anything permanent in all of this. What we are calling the I is not the permanent factor itself, but what experiences permanency. In this field, we must formulate our concepts very clearly so that no misunderstandings arise. When we become aware of something lasting or permanent within the changing flow of our inner experiences, the feeling of I begins to dawn on us. The fact that a being feels hunger, for instance, cannot give it a feeling of I hunger sets in when its recurrent causes make themselves felt in the being in question, which then attacks its food with gusto simply because these recurrent causes are present. The feeling of I does not appear when recurrent causes of hunger drive us to seek food. It appears when, in addition to this, we retain an awareness of our pleasure on a previous occasion when our hunger was satisfied, so that our desire for food is driven by past experience, as well as by our current experience of hunger. The physical body would fall apart if the ether body did not hold it together. The ether body would sink into unconsciousness if the astral body did not illumine it. Likewise, the astral body would repeatedly forget the past if the I did not rescue this past and carry it over into the present. What death is to the physical body and sleep to the ether body, forgetting is to the astral body. We can also say that life belongs to the ether body, consciousness to the astral body, and memory to the I. Falling into the error of ascribing memory to animals is even easier than ascribing consciousness to plants. It is natural to think of memory when a dog recognizes its owners after perhaps not having seen them for a long time. In reality, however, this recognition is not based on memory but on something totally different. The dog feels a certain attraction for its owners, which proceeds from their very being. This gives the dog pleasure when its owners are present. Each time they are again present after an absence, the dog's pleasure recurs. Memory, however, is only present when a being not only feels its experiences in the present but also retains those of the past. Even if we acknowledge this, we might still fall into the error of thinking that the dog remembers. We could say, for instance, that since the dog grieves when its owners leave, it retains a memory of them. This, too, is an incorrect assessment of the situation. Through sharing life with its owners, the dog comes to need their presence and thus feels their absence in the same way that it feels hunger. If we do not make such distinctions, life's true circumstances will not become clear to us. Certain biases might make us object to this presentation and say that we cannot know whether or not anything similar to human memory is present in animals. This objection is based on untrained observation. If we are really capable of observing factually how an animal behaves in the context of its experiences, we will notice the difference between its behavior and that of a human being and will realize that the animal's behavior is in keeping with the absence of memory. This fact is immediately clear to supersensible observation. But in addition, the effects of what enters human consciousness directly during supersensible observation enable our thought-permeated sensory perception to recognize it. If we say that we become aware of our own memory by inwardly observing our own souls, while we cannot do the same with the soul of an animal, this statement is based on a fateful error. What we can say about our own capacity for memory does not come from inwardly observing our souls, but only from what we experience with regard to ourselves in relationship to the objects and processes of the outer world. We experience this with regard to ourselves, with regard to other human beings, and also with regard to animals in exactly the same way. We are blinded by illusion when we believe that we assess the presence of memory only on the basis of inner observation. Although we may say that the power that underlies memory is an inner power, our assessment of it, even with regard to ourselves, is acquired from the outer world by looking at the context of life. We are able to assess this context with regard to an animal in the same way that we can assess it with regard to ourselves. Contemporary psychology suffers a great deal in this respect from its totally untrained and inexact ideas, which are highly deceptive due to errors in observation. It would be very easy to misunderstand this book's explanations of the faculty of memory. It will not be immediately apparent to people who consider only outer processes that there is a difference between what happens in memory-like occurrences in animals or even in plants and what is described here as real memory in human beings. It is true that when an animal does something for the third or fourth time, to all outer appearances it may well seem that memory and the learning associated with it are actually present. Like some natural scientists and their followers, we might even extend the concept of memory to include what happens when a chick creeps out of its shell and begins pecking at grain. It even knows the precise movements it needs to make with its head and body in order to do this. We might say that since it cannot have learned this while still in the shell, it must have learned it from the thousands and thousands of creatures who were its ancestors. This is what Herring says, for example. It is quite possible to describe this phenomenon as something that looks like memory. But if we do not consider the unique process that takes place in human beings, which is a process of really perceiving earlier experiences at later points in time rather than merely a process by which earlier conditions influence later ones, we will never be able to really grasp the essence of human nature. In this book, the perception of the past, and not merely its reappearance, even in a changed form, at a later time, is what will be called memory. If we chose to use this word for the corresponding processes in the plant and animal kingdoms, we would need to have another one to apply to human beings. The word itself is not what is important in the discussion above. What is important is that with regard to understanding the essential nature of the human being, we must recognize the difference. It is equally impossible to relate the apparently highly intelligent accomplishments of animals to what is being called memory here. For the eye, remembering and forgetting signify something very similar to what waking and sleeping signify for the astral body. Just as sleep allows the cares and troubles of the day to disappear into nothingness, forgetting spreads a veil over life's bad experiences, blotting out part of the past. And just as we need sleep to strengthen our exhausted life forces again, we also need to eradicate certain parts of our past from our memory in order to approach new experiences freely and without bias. Forgetting is precisely what develops our strength to perceive something new. Think about things like learning how to write, for instance. All the detailed steps that children have to go through in learning how to write are forgotten, and what remains is the ability to write. How could we possibly write if all our past experiences of learning how to do it arose again in our souls as memories each time we put pen to paper? Now, memory appears in various stages. Its simplest form is when we perceive an object and can then turn away from it and reawaken a mental image of it. This mental image was formed while we were perceiving the object, in a process that took place between our astral body and our eye. The astral body made the outer impression of the object become conscious, but we would have been aware of the object only for as long as it was actually present if the eye had not absorbed this knowledge and taken possession of it. This is the point where supersensible observation separates our bodily nature from our soul nature. We speak of the astral body as long as we have in mind the birth of knowledge about an object that is present. What gives permanence to this knowledge, however, we then call the soul. But from what has just been said, we can immediately see how closely the human astral body is linked to the part of the soul that gives permanence to knowledge. These two things are united into a single element of our human makeup, so to speak, and, therefore, this union can also be called the astral body. If we want exact terms, we can also call the human astral body the soul body and the soul, to the extent that it is united with this soul body, the sentient soul. The eye rises to a higher level of its essential nature when it directs its activity toward the aspects of this object knowledge that it has made its own. Through this activity, the eye detaches itself more and more from perceived objects in order to work within what it has made its own. The part of the soul where this happens can be called the intellectual soul or mind soul. It is characteristic of both the sentient and mind souls that they work with what they receive through impressions of objects perceived by the senses and then retained in memory. Here the soul is totally given over to something external to it. Even what it takes possession of through memory has been received from outside. However, the soul can transcend all this. It consists of more than just the sentient and mind souls. It is easiest for the supersensible view to provide some idea of this by pointing to a single simple fact whose comprehensive significance needs to be appreciated. Within the entire scope of our language, there is only one name whose essential character distinguishes it from all others. That name is I. Any other name can be applied to the thing or being to whom it belongs by any human being, but as a designation for a being, I has meaning only when that being applies it to itself. The name I can never be heard coming from outside as the name of the listener, one can only apply it to oneself. I am an I only to myself, I am a you to anyone else and anyone else is a you to me. This state of affairs is the outward expression of a deeply significant truth. The actual essential nature of the I is independent of anything external, therefore, nothing outside of it can call it by its name. Religious denominations that have consciously maintained their connection to the supersensible view call the term I the ineffable name of God. This points to what has just been indicated. Nothing external has access to the part of the human soul we are looking at now. This is the soul's hidden shrine, and only a being that is of the same nature as the soul can gain entrance there. The God who dwells within the human being begins to speak when the soul recognizes itself as an I. Just as the sentient and mind souls dwell in the outer world, a third soul element immerses itself in the divine when the soul achieves perception of its own being. It is easy to misunderstand this view as a declaration that the I and God are one and the same. However, it does not state that the I is God, but only that it is of the same character and essence as the divine. If we took a drop of water out of the sea, would we be claiming that it is the sea if we said that the drop is of the same essence or substance as the sea? If we absolutely want to use a comparison, we can say that the drop is to the sea as the I is to the divine. We can find a divine element in ourselves because our own primal being is taken from the divine. Thus, through this third part of the human soul, we acquire inner knowledge of ourselves, just as we acquire knowledge of the outer world through the astral body. This is why esoteric science can call this third soul element the consciousness soul. In an esoteric scientific sense, the soul consists of three parts: the sentient soul, the mind soul, and the consciousness soul, just as the body consists of three parts: the physical body, the ether body, and the astral body. Psychological errors in observation, similar to those already mentioned regarding the erroneous assessment of the capacity for memory, make it difficult to acquire the right kind of insight into the essential nature of the I. Many things we believe we understand can seem to refute what is presented above, while in reality they confirm it. This is the case, for example, with Eduard von Hartmann's comments on the I in his outline of psychology. In the first place, self-awareness is older than the word I. Personal pronouns are a rather late product of the evolution of languages. They are of value to language only as abbreviations. The word I is a shorter substitute for the speaker's own name, but a substitute that each speaker, as such, uses for him or herself, regardless of what proper name others may apply to him or her. Self-awareness can develop to a very great extent in animals and in untaught people with severe speech and hearing impairments, even without reference to a proper name. Awareness of one's own name can fully replace the absence of the use of the word I. This insight eliminates the magical aura that envelopes the little word I in the minds of many people. This word cannot contribute in the least to the concept of self-awareness, rather, it receives its entire content from that concept. We can agree completely with such views. We can also agree that no magical aura should be attached to the little word I to darken our thoughtful consideration of the matter. But the nature of a thing is not determined by how gradually the word designating it came about. The important point is that the essential being of the I in self-awareness is older than the word I, and that we are compelled to use this particular little word, endowed with qualities belonging to it alone, for the element in our interrelationship with the outer world that is different from what an animal can experience. Nothing can be shown about the nature of a triangle by showing how the word triangle came about. Similarly, nothing can be concluded about the nature of the I by knowing how the word developed out of a different verbal usage in the course of the evolution of language. The true nature of the I first reveals itself in the consciousness soul. The soul loses itself to other things in feeling and intellect, but as the consciousness soul it takes hold of its own being. That's why the consciousness soul's perception of the I can take place only through a certain inner activity. Mental images of outer objects, formed as these objects come and go, work on in our intellect through a power of their own. However, if the I is to perceive itself, it cannot simply surrender itself. In order to be conscious of its own being, it must first use inner activity to lift its being up out of its own depths. When the I is perceived, that is, when self-reflection takes place, an inner activity of the I begins. Through this activity, perceiving the I in the consciousness soul acquires a quite different meaning for the human being than perceiving everything that approaches us through our three bodily elements and the other two parts of the soul. The force that makes the I manifest in the consciousness soul is actually the same force that makes itself known in all the rest of the world, but in the body and in the lower soul elements, it does not appear directly, but reveals itself in stages through its effects. Its lowest manifestation takes place through the physical body, it then rises step by step to what fills the mind's soul. We might say that at each step in its ascent, another veil cloaking the hidden element falls away. In what fills the consciousness soul, this hidden element steps unveiled into the innermost temple of the soul, where it appears as only a drop in the sea of all-pervading spirituality. Here, however, we must first take hold of this spirituality. We must recognize it in ourselves so that we are then also able to find it in its manifestations. What makes its way like a drop into the consciousness soul is called the spirit by esoteric science. In this way the consciousness soul is united with the spirit, which is the hidden element in everything manifest. When we want to grasp the spirit in all of the revealed world, we must do so in the same way that we grasp the I in the consciousness soul. The activity that led us to perceive this I must now be directed toward the manifest world. In doing this, we evolve to higher levels of our being and add something new to the body and soul elements of our human makeup. To begin with, we conquer what lies hidden in the lower parts of the soul. This takes place through work on the soul that proceeds from the I. How a person is involved in this work becomes evident when we compare a noble idealist to someone who is still totally given up to lower desires and so-called sensual pleasures. Such a person can become a noble idealist by withdrawing from certain base inclinations and turning toward higher ones, that is, by working out of the I to have an ennobling and spiritualizing effect on his or her own soul. The I becomes the master within that person's soul life. This can be taken to the point where no desire or craving can find a place in the soul unless the I allows it to enter. In this way, the entire soul becomes a revelation of the I, as was previously true only of the consciousness soul. Fundamentally, all of our cultural activity and spiritual endeavors consist of work that aims for this mastery by the I. All human beings who are alive at present are involved in this work, whether or not they choose to be and whether or not they are conscious of it. But this work leads to higher levels of our essential human nature and develops new parts of our makeup that are hidden behind what is manifest to us. Not only can we master the soul by working on it out of the I so that it reveals what is hidden in the manifest, but we can also take this work further and extend it to the astral body. The I then takes possession of the astral body by uniting with its hidden nature. This astral body that is conquered and transformed by the I can be called the spirit self. This is the same as what is called manas in the traditions of Eastern wisdom. The spirit self constitutes a higher element of our human makeup, one that is present in it in embryonic form, as it were, and emerges more and more in the course of working on ourselves. Just as we conquer the astral body by making our way through to the hidden forces standing behind it, this also happens with the ether body in the course of our inner development. Working on the ether body, however, is more intensive than working on the astral body because what is concealed in the ether body is cloaked in two veils, while what is hidden in the astral is cloaked in only a single veil. We can get an idea of the differences in working on each of these two bodies by pointing to certain changes that can take place in us in the course of our development. First, let's think about how certain soul qualities develop when the I works on the soul, how passion and desire, joy and sorrow may change. All we need to do is to think back to our childhood. What gave us pleasure then? What caused us pain? What have we learned? What have we added to what we were able to do as children? All of this is only an expression of how the I gained mastery over the astral body, because the astral body is the vehicle of passion and sorrow, of joy and pain. In contrast, there are certain other qualities of ours, such as our temperament and the deeper idiosyncrasies of our character, that change relatively little over time. Someone who was hot-tempered as a child will often retain certain aspects of this violent temper in later life. This point is so striking that there are theorists who totally deny the possibility of any fundamental change in a person's character. They assume that this remains constant throughout a person's life, simply revealing itself in one direction or another. However, this conclusion is based on lack of observation. It is clear to anyone who has the capacity to observe such things that even a person's character and temperament change under the influence of the I, although this change is slow in relationship to the change in the qualities described above. To use a comparison, the relationship between the two kinds of change is like the movement of the hour hand of a clock in relationship to the minute hand. Now, the forces that bring about changes in a person's character or temperament belong to the hidden domain of the ether body. They are of the same nature as the forces that govern the living kingdom, that is, the forces that serve the processes of growth, nutrition, and reproduction. Explanations that will be presented later on in this book will shed the right light on these things. It is not possible to draw a fixed boundary between the changes that take place as a result of the activity of the I in the astral body and those that take place in the ether body, since they blend into each other. If something we learn enhances our faculty of judgment, a change has taken place in the astral body, but if this judgment changes our state of mind so that we become accustomed to feeling differently about a subject after having learned about it, then a change has taken place in the ether body. Everything we take possession of in such a way that we can recall it again and again is based on a change in the ether body. Anything that gradually becomes an entrenched part of the wealth of our memory rests on the fact that the work performed on the astral body has been transferred to the ether body. The I is not working on the astral body when we simply give ourselves up to pleasure and suffering, joy and pain, but only when the idiosyncrasies of these soul qualities begin to change. Likewise, this work extends to the ether body when our I applies its activity to changing our traits of character, our temperament, and so on. Every individual is working on this change, too, whether consciously or not. In ordinary life, the strongest impulses working on behalf of this change are religious ones. When our I allows impulses that flow from religion to work on it again and again, these impulses develop a strength within the I that works right through into the ether body and transforms it, just as lesser impulses in life cause a transformation of the astral body. These lesser impulses, which come to us through learning, thinking, ennobling our feelings, and so on, are subject to the many and various changes in our life, but religious feelings leave a uniform imprint on all our thinking, feeling, and willing. They shed a common, uniform light on our whole soul life, so to speak. We think and feel one way today, another way tomorrow, prompted by a great variety of causes. But if, because of religious feelings of whatever sort, we divine the presence of something that remains constant through all these changes, we will relate both today's and tomorrow's soul experiences to this fundamental feeling. Religious belief, therefore, has a far-reaching effect on our soul life that becomes stronger and stronger with time because it works through constant repetition. This is why it acquires the strength to work on our ether body. True art has similar effects on us. If, through the outer form, color, or tone of a work of art we are able to penetrate to its spiritual foundation with our thought and feeling, then the impulses our I receives as a result actually work right through to the ether body. If we think this thought through to its conclusion, we can assess art's tremendous significance for all of human development and evolution. We have referred here to only a few examples of things that provide the I with impulses to work on the ether body. There are many such influences in our lives that are not so readily apparent to the observing eye as the ones that have been mentioned here. From these, however, it is evident that there is an additional part of our human makeup hidden within us, and that the I is gradually developing it. We can call this second spiritual element the life spirit. This is the same as what is called Buddhi in the traditions of Eastern wisdom. Life spirit is the appropriate term for this because the forces active within it are the same forces that are active in the life body. The only difference is that when they manifest as the life body, the human I is not active in them. However, when they manifest as the life spirit, they are imbued with the activity of the I. Our intellectual development and the extent to which we purify and ennoble our displays of feeling and will are the measure of our transformation of the astral body into the spirit self, while religious and other related experiences leave an imprint on our ether body and turn it into the life spirit. In the course of ordinary life, this happens more or less unconsciously. In contrast, in what is known as initiation, supersensible knowledge points out the means that allow us to take this work on the spirit self and life spirit quite consciously in hand. These means will be discussed in later sections of this book. For the moment, the most important thing is simply to show that in addition to the body and the soul, the spirit is also active within the human being. Later, we will also see how this spirit belongs to the human being's eternal aspect, in contrast to the transitory body. The activity of the I, however, is not limited to working on the astral body and the ether body. It also extends to the physical body. A trace of the influence of the I can be seen, for instance, when a person blushes or turns pale under certain circumstances. In this case, the I actually triggers a process in the physical body. When changes take place in a person through the activity of the I, specifically with regard to its influence on the physical body, the I is actually united with the physical body's hidden forces, with the same forces that bring about physical processes in it. We can then say that the I is working on the physical body through this activity. This statement must not be misunderstood. We must not assume that this work is something crudely material. What appears in a crudely material way in the physical body is only the manifest aspect of this work. Its essential forces are spiritual in nature and lie hidden behind this manifestation. We are not speaking here of work on the physical body's manifest material aspect, but of spiritual work on the invisible forces that bring the body into existence and later cause it to disintegrate again. In ordinary life, the work of the I on the physical body enters our consciousness to only a very limited degree of clarity. We arrive at complete clarity only when we take this work consciously in hand under the influence of supersensible knowledge. At that point, however, it becomes apparent that there is a third spiritual part to the human being. This may be called the spirit body, in contrast to the physical human being. In Eastern wisdom, this spirit body is called the Atma. It is also easy to be misled with regard to the spirit body because we view the physical body as the human being's lowest component and, therefore, have difficulty coming to terms with the fact that working on this physical body is supposed to result in the highest part of our human makeup. But the very fact that the physical body conceals the spirit active in it behind three veils is the reason why the highest form of inner work is needed to unite the I with the spirit hidden there. Thus, the human being appears to esoteric science as a being made up of different elements. Those of a bodily nature are the physical body, the ether body, and the astral body. Those belonging to the soul are the sentient soul, the mind soul, and the consciousness soul. The light of the I shines forth within the soul. The spiritual elements are the spirit self, the life spirit, and the spirit body. It follows from the descriptions above that the sentient soul and the astral body are closely united and constitute a unity in a certain respect. Likewise, the consciousness soul and the spirit self constitute a unity, because the consciousness soul is where the spirit flares up and radiates outward into the other parts of our human makeup. Taking this into consideration, we can speak of the following configuration of the human being. The astral body and the sentient soul can be combined into a single element, as can the consciousness soul and the spirit self. We can simply call the mind soul the I because it takes part in the nature of the I. In a certain respect, it already is the I that has not yet become aware of its spiritual nature. This results in 7 components of the human being: 1. The physical body, 2. The ether body or life body, 3. The astral body, 4. The I, 5. The spirit self, 6. The life spirit, and 7. The spirit body. This 7-fold configuration of the human being need not have anything vaguely magical about it, as people who are used to materialistic concepts so often claim. If these people would simply stick closely to the meaning of the descriptions above and not superimpose this element of magic from the very beginning, we ought to speak of these 7 parts of the human being no differently from how we speak of the 7 colors that make up light or the 7 notes that constitute a scale, if we consider the octave to be a repetition of the tonic. The only difference is that we are speaking from the viewpoint of a higher method of observing the world. Just as light appears in 7 colors and sound in a 7-fold scale, homogeneous human nature appears in the 7 differentiations described above. Just as there is nothing inherently superstitious about the number 7 in tone and color, this is also the case with regard to differentiation in the human being. During one oral presentation on this subject, someone remarked that, in the case of colors, the number 7 is not correct, because there are other colors, invisible to the eye, that lie beyond red and violet. Even taking this into account, however, the analogy to colors holds good, because our human makeup actually extends beyond the physical body on the one hand and the spirit body on the other. These extensions, however, are spiritually invisible to methods of supersensible observation, just as the colors beyond red and violet are invisible to the physical eye. It was necessary to respond to this remark, because it is so easy to think that supersensible observation is amateurish and imprecise in how it uses ideas from the natural sciences. However, anyone who pays strict attention to the intended meaning of what is said here will find that it actually never contradicts true natural science, neither when natural scientific facts are used for purposes of illustration, nor when remarks made here point to a direct relationship to natural scientific research.